Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we have a brand new video for you guys. How is that? Does that make more sense? Maybe I'll go with that in the future. Now today I wanted to have a look at a couple of players throughout RuneScape's history that have had a massive effect on the RuneScape economy. Now these players have single-handedly and significantly had a massive effect on the prices of certain items, either through owning the entire market for it, having certain skills that no one else had, or even good old-fashioned shitposting on Reddit. Now while these players all used different strategies, in the end they made a ton of money and really affected the RuneScape economy in a pretty big way. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Before I get started here, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, I would really appreciate it if you took the time to hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to be notified whenever I release a new video, which currently is about 5 times a week, go ahead and hit that bell icon as well. I appreciate it. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. Let's get started. Now first up here we have a really interesting story back from the 2010 era, and this is when the trade restriction was in effect. Now I don't know if you guys remember the mint cake fiasco. Now first up here, mint cakes are a very rare item, and in 2010 they were only obtainable from the Gnome restaurant minigame, and they were obtained at a very rare rate. Now they were kind of perceived as a valuable item just because of how rare they were, and they were occasionally used in junk item trades back then, and they did retain some value until February 1st of 2010, where an update came through which buffed the amount you would get from every Gnome restaurant completion up to 8 to 10, which quickly devalued their price. However, before that happened in 2010, something really interesting happened, and that was their price spiked from around 10,000 each up to 1 to 2 million as their street price, and that happened in a very short period of time and seemingly for no reason. Now the players always kind of wonder what the reason for that was, and a couple years ago someone wrote something in actually an Ask Reddit thread that talked about the entire mint cake fiasco. Now there's kind of a really funny story behind it which I'm not going to read out loud here just in case I get demonetized, but I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go ahead and read it. But because the mint cake was kind of an inside joke, let's call it that, between a couple, this one player was a very known mercher and decided to start buying out mint cakes as quickly as possible. Now this person claims that they started hoarding a ton of them, which actually was the root cause of why the price went from 10,000 each to over 100 times that. And they also claim they ended up selling their entire stack for a huge profit, unintentionally pulling off one of the largest market manipulations in RuneScape history. People were very confused about this because there was no real reason as to why this item would go up in price, because it was pretty much a junk item that only healed your run energy and would never be worth that much. Now there is no way to really corroborate this story, but regardless, we know that the mint cake did increase in value, and regardless of the reason, it did have a massive effect on the economy, and for a couple of different reasons. Now the main reason was that the mint cake had a GE value of only around 20,000, and that was because of how quickly the mint cake increased in value, but even today that does still happen. Things will be way overvalued and their GE price will show a much lower value, but today that isn't such a big deal because there's no trade restrictions or anything like that. However, back in 2010 there were trade restrictions, and having something that was valueless on the Grand Exchange but had incredible street value kind of broke the game. For one, that made high stakes gambling possible again. Even with the minuscule trade difference you're allowed to have, which if the mint cakes had a street value of 8 mil, then you could effectively stake 24 mil again. And on top of that, mint cakes made it a lot easier to real world trade again. And that is why I think Jagex did take the initiative to make them more common, just so this exact occurrence of real world trading, high stakes gambling could be nicked, and then things would return to normal. Still, I think extremely fascinating regardless of the reason. It did have a massive effect on the economy. Okay, next up here we have a very famous player, and their name is Blue Rose 13X. Now Blue Rose 13X is very well known for one, co-founding the fan website tip.it, and also being the first player to reach level 99 smithing and magic back in RuneScape Classic. Now how did this player affect the RuneScape economy back in Classic? Well, it's pretty simple. Now the Rune armor set was released back in July of 2001. And as you all know, Runite weaponry and Runite armor has a very high smithing requirement. Now as Blue Rose 13X was the first person to reach level 99 smithing, they literally had a stranglehold on the Runite market, as there was actually no other way to get most pieces of Runite gear. Now some were available from shops and some were available as a monster drop, but most of them weren't, which means by being the first player to be 99 smithing, they could charge whatever they wanted. Now as she was the only one with 99 smithing, and in combination with the fact that they really only sold to elite and prominent players, this kept the price extremely high for a very long time. Now for example, back in RuneScape Classic, Rune two-handers when they were released were about 1.5 million GP just because Blue Rose was the only player to be able to make it. Now the prices never really stabilized until 2002-2003 when Zezima, well-known player of course, and other players started free smithing them for everyone, which then did lower the price. But even with a handful of players having 99 smithing, the price would still be extremely high because there's such a big demand for it, as it was at the time the best late game gear. With supply and demand at play, obviously the items are going to be very expensive. Now because of their achievement, they were one of the richest players in the game at the time. Her bank back in RuneScape Classic was estimated to be at around 3 to 4 billion GP, which is absolute insanity for RuneScape Classic. Now I really like this event because it's pretty easy to comprehend what happened. It doesn't really have anything to do with being sneaky or underhanded. They literally just grinded it out, got there first, and reaped a huge amount of rewards from doing it. It kind of makes you wonder if something similar happened in old school RuneScape when it was released. Obviously someone was the first person to 99 smithing, but the fact that everything is so much quicker nowadays probably didn't have the price so elevated like back in RuneScape Classic, which I think is just a really interesting piece of RuneScape history and someone who really took advantage. And I would kind of call this one of the greatest merches of all time, really. Okay, so this next story is from old school RuneScape and it has to do with the Ahrimsstaff. Now, back in 2017, the Ahrimsstaff was terrible, and it was terrible for one main reason, and that was the fact that it was a two-handed weapon, and there are not that many two-handed mage weapons. It was so terrible, in fact, that pretty much every single weapon in the game that was one-handed was better than the Ahrimsstaff. That was because the bonuses from wearing an offhand greatly outweighed the negative bonuses of having a non-mage weapon, and as the Ahrimsstaff didn't really provide any good magical attack bonuses, it was pretty much the worst Barrows weapon and the worst mage weapon in the entire game. Now, quite some time before the staff got buffed, a player started stocking up on it. This player is called Fatsmers Tafthub, or BuffAhrimsstaff backwards. And they had around 500 mil to invest in the Ahrimsstaff. It was a pretty safe bet, to be honest, because the Ahrimsstaff was almost at alch price at the time, which means the risk was pretty much none, because if for some reason this merch didn't work, they could just alch all of the Ahrimsstaffs, or they'd probably sell for something similar on the Grand Exchange anyway. Now, as they were going to be leaving the game for a while, they decided to invest some of their money into the Ahrimsstaff. They bought them for around 45 to 55k, and then they started to think of what would actually be a good buff. Now, the title of this Reddit thread is called "My Loot from 7 Months of Shit Posting on Reddit," and that is pretty much what they did. They just started making memes, started posting discussions, and kind of put the Ahrimsstaff back on the radar as to why it was so terrible and why it deserved a buff. Now, after grinding away at it for long enough, it actually did come up on the Q&A, and then subsequently got some traction, and eventually the Ahrimsstaff actually did get buffed. Now, what they ended up changing about it is the Ahrimsstaff became a one-handed weapon and received a 5% magic damage bonus, which is a pretty significant buff. Now, over the last year, this player managed to obtain around 9,500 Ahrimsstaffs, which is a massive amount. Now, this player ended up unloading all the items at around 300,000 when the buff was initially being pulled, and they ended up selling it for 1.8 billion GP, which means they made about a 1.3 bill profit. But more importantly, this player managed to single-handedly have a massive effect on the price of a single item. I mean, the Ahrimsstaff needed a buff anyway, so it's not like they were doing this purely to take advantage. And I don't think we should ever inhibit making game changes just based on someone having hoarded an item and taken advantage of it. I don't think that should be a consideration. And finally here we have probably the most famous mercher from old school RuneScape. I mean, besides me. No, I'm kidding. Now, I am of course talking about Wilson. Now, Wilson used a very smart, maybe a little ruthless strategy on merching the Third Age weapons when they were released. Now, he was very well known for merching the Third Age longsword, but he kind of did a bit of everything. Now, these items were released back in June of 2014, and as you know, Third Age items are exceedingly rare, and the Third Age longsword was one of the rarest of them. Now, Wilson's strategy was to own the monopoly of Third Age weaponry and Third Age armor sets. Now, as there were so few Third Age items in the game, even buying a few of them could pretty much take up the entire market on the Grand Exchange. So if someone really wanted the item and couldn't buy it on the Grand Exchange, well, they had to go to Wilson. And it got to the point where the Third Age longsword was worth 4 billion GP, which means anyone who sold it on the Grand Exchange was actually shooting themselves in the foot. Wilson could have an offer in at max cash in the GE, and then later flip it on the street for $1 billion GP in profit. Now this only really worked because the items were so rare and Wilson had enough capital to make it work. Now he also did this on the Third Age bow, Third Age wands, Third Age cloaks, pretty much any item that was rare enough and expensive enough for it to be prohibitive for anyone else to really contest him for it. And that's probably the most famous story from old school RuneScape. Anyway guys, that is going to be it for today's video. Those are a few different occurrences throughout RuneScape's history where smart players managed to take advantage of the economy in a few different ways and made loads of money doing it. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you took the time to leave the video a like. Always helps out with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.